5 important signs God has heard your prayers. There are seasons in a believer's life when heaven seems silent. When your words rise like smoke yet seem to vanish into the air. You kneel, you whisper, you weep, and the quiet feels endless. You begin to wonder, does God still hear me? But silence is not the same as absence. The God who formed your voice hears every trembling syllable. His seeming quiet is not neglect. It is often preparation. The pause between your prayer and his answer is sacred space, where faith learns to breathe. When God hears you, something begins to shift, not always around you, but within you. It often begins with a peace that makes no sense at all. The circumstance remains unchanged, yet your heart grows still. The mind that once spun with fear becomes strangely calm. It is as though heaven has exhaled into your soul, saying, "Be still, I've heard you." This peace doesn't come from logic or outcome. It flows from knowing you've been received. It is the quiet confidence that your cry has found its way home. And yet sometimes, the hearing of God hides itself in delay. We often mistake waiting for rejection, but delay is one of God's most eloquent languages. The Father who loves you too deeply to rush his purpose is shaping something eternal in the space between your asking and his answering. The silence is not a void, it is a forge, where patience, trust, and surrender are refined. What feels like God doing nothing is often God doing the most important work of all, preparing you for what you've asked for. If you pay attention, you'll notice how he begins to move subtly, not in thunder, but in whispers. A door opens you didn't even knock on. A conversation brings healing you didn't plan. A thought revisits you with new meaning. God's answers rarely arrive with spectacle. They unfold like dawn, quiet, inevitable, faithful. Providence has a gentle touch, but it leaves unmistakable fingerprints. Then something else happens. Your prayers begin to change. Where once you pleaded for outcomes, now you ask for alignment. You stop trying to persuade God and start asking to be transformed by him. What you wanted begins to matter less than who you are becoming. That shift, that surrender, is no small thing. It is the evidence of divine hearing. For no heart turns toward holiness on its own. It turns because heaven has already answered. And perhaps the clearest sign of all is this: you begin to want him more than the thing you prayed for. The desire that drove you to your knees becomes the doorway through which you find him. You realize that what you needed most was never merely provision, but presence. The answered prayer is not the gift itself. He is. So if you find yourself praying and waiting, do not mistake silence for distance. Look for peace that quiets your fears. Notice the subtle changes shaping your path. Watch how your desires are being purified. Feel how your heart is being drawn closer to him. These are not coincidences. They are sacred confirmations that God has indeed heard you. For the God who listens does not simply give answers, he gives himself. And when your soul can rest in that truth, you'll discover that being heard by God is not merely about getting what you asked for. It's about becoming who created to be in his presence. There is a kind of peace that no human language can describe. A stillness that descends upon the soul after it has poured itself out before God. It is not the fragile calm that comes when problems vanish, nor the shallow relief of temporary distraction. It is something far deeper, the quiet assurance that comes when heaven has heard your voice. Scripture calls it the peace that surpasses understanding, and those who have tasted it know that it cannot be manufactured or explained. It arrives uninvited, often when circumstances are still dark, and it wraps the heart in a strange and holy warmth. This peace is not the reward of eloquent prayer, nor the result of perfect faith. It is the work of a Father who listens more to your sincerity than to your vocabulary. When you bring your burdens to him with trembling hands, he does not measure the strength of your words, he measures the surrender of your heart. And when he has heard you, something begins to settle inside, not because your storm has ceased, but because you've discovered who stands within it with you. Many imagine that answered prayer must come with visible change, the debt paid, the sickness healed, the door opened. But God often answers first within the inner life. Before he moves mountains outside of you, he calms the waves within you. The heart that once beat with fear begins to rest, not because the valley has lifted, but because you now sense the shepherd walking beside you. This peace is not a luxury, it is a divine signature. Evidence in God has inclined toward your cry. The world cannot comprehend such serenity. It believes peace is the product of control, that one must arrange life precisely to feel safe. But the child of God learns that true peace begins when control is released. The more you insist on steering the ship, the more the winds will terrify you. Yet the moment you let go, the moment you say, "Lord, you take it," something supernatural happens. The winds may still blow, but the fear begins to fade. That is the first quiet whisper of divine acknowledgement, "I have heard you." There is a mystery in how this peace arrives. You cannot predict it or summon it at will. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the night, when the tears have stopped and exhaustion has silenced your thoughts. Sometimes it comes during worship, when the words of a song unlock something sacred in you. And sometimes it comes quietly, during the most ordinary moment of your day. You are washing dishes, driving to work, or sitting alone, and suddenly you feel that deep, unexplainable calm. The burden has not vanished, but it no longer feels unbearable. That is the Spirit's gentle confirmation that heaven has taken up your case. To the world, this seems like self-deception, as though peace without resolution is denial. But believers know that this is not delusion, it is divine communication. God's peace is not a placebo, it is proof. It is the echo of His promise reverberating in your spirit, telling you that your prayer has reached its destination. It is heaven's way of saying, "Rest, my child. I have heard you, and I am working even now." This peace also teaches something profound about God's nature. It reminds us that He values relationship more than results. The moment you pray, He begins to draw near, not merely to fix your problem but to form your heart. His answer is not always a changed circumstance, but a changed posture. You rise from prayer no longer clutching your anxieties, but holding His presence instead. You walk away lighter, not because the load has disappeared, but because He now carries it with you. And as this peace takes root, you begin to see the world differently. You no longer measure God's faithfulness by what you can see, you measure it by what you know in your spirit. Fear loses its vocabulary, worry loses its grip. You begin to understand that being heard by God is itself a miracle, that your small, human voice can reach the heart of the infinite. And that awareness, that quiet wonder, becomes the anchor of your soul. The saints of old knew this secret. They endured persecution, loss, and suffering, yet they radiated peace, not because their lives were easy, but because they had learned the holy art of resting in the certainty that God listens. Every sigh, every whisper, every tear was heard, and that knowledge was enough. That same peace still visits those who pray today, not as an emotional high, but as the steady, reassuring presence of the God who hears. So when you have prayed and the world looks unchanged, do not despair. Wait for the peace. It may come softly, but when it does, you will know. It will feel like the calm after a storm you thought would never end. A peace that is not of this world, yet fits perfectly within your heart. And in that sacred quiet, you will understand that heaven has not been silent at all. Waiting is one of the hardest disciplines in the Christian life. We live in a world addicted to immediacy. Fast answers, fast relief, fast results. Yet the God who holds time in His hands is in no hurry. He works according to eternals, not earthly schedules, and when His silence stretches long, the heart begins to ache with questions. Has He heard me? Has He forgotten? Why hasn't anything changed? But the longer you walk with God, the more you learn that His delays are not denials. They are divine strategies of love. Every delay has purpose, though we rarely see it in the moment. God's timing is not designed to frustrate you, but to prepare you. There are prayers He could answer immediately, but if He did, the blessing might break you. A door opened too soon can crush an unready heart. What feels like waiting is often the mercy of a Father who knows the strength of your soul better than you do. He is shaping you for what He has already prepared and shaping what He has prepared for you. There are seasons when God hides His hand, though His heart remains near. You see no movement, no sign, no shift, only stillness. It feels like abandonment, but it is actually invitation. God's silence is never empty, it is full of purpose. It is in the quiet that faith is proven genuine. Anyone can trust when prayers are answered immediately. But faith that endures silence is faith that has learned to love the giver more than the gift. The waiting is where trust matures from a seed into a tree. Think of Abraham, who waited decades for a single promise. Think of Joseph, who carried a vision while sitting in a prison. Think of David, anointed as king yet chased through caves before he ever touched a throne. Their waiting was not wasted, it was woven into their becoming. God was not merely preparing a blessing, He was preparing them. The same is true for you. Every delay refines your patience, deepens your humility, strengthens your obedience, and teaches your heart to anchor itself not in outcomes, but in God Himself. Sometimes, delay is God's way of aligning the world around your prayer. There are people who must cross your path, doors that must be built before they can open, hearts that must soften before they can receive you. You may not see it, but the machinery of divine providence is moving quietly behind the curtain of your waiting. The silence is not inactivity, it is orchestration. Heaven is arranging what will, in time, reveal itself as perfect timing. There are moments, too, when delay becomes a mirror. It shows you what you truly desire. When you pray and God tarries, you begin to see whether you wanted the thing itself or the one who gives it. The longer you wait, the more your motives are refined. You learn to say, even if the answer never comes, I will still trust you. That kind of surrender is not defeat, it is victory. For when your faith no longer depends on outcomes, you have entered the holy territory of peace. What seems like God's refusal is often His greatest kindness. If He were to give you everything you ask for, exactly when you ask, you would never grow in wisdom or dependence. A parent who gives a child every desire spoils, not nurtures. But the Father in heaven loves too deeply to give too quickly. His no is sometimes protection, His delay is sometimes preparation. And when the appointed moment arrives, the answer will come with a beauty that makes the waiting worthwhile. There is a rhythm in God's responses, a cadence that can only be heard by those who stay near Him long enough. When you stop measuring His love by how quickly He answers, and start trusting that delay is still divine attention, something changes in you. The anxiety that once consumed becomes replaced by quiet expectation. You begin to see time itself as sacred, not wasted. You realize that waiting is not the absence of God's activity, it is His activity. He is working in the unseen, not ignoring you but shaping eternity around you. And when the answer finally comes, it will not only meet your need, it will reveal His nature. You will look back and see that the path you thought was delay was actually direction. The silence you resented was the soil from which stronger faith grew. You will realize that His timing was never late, because He was never absent. He was with you in every moment of the waiting, whispering, I have heard you. Trust my time. If you are waiting now, do not let despair speak louder than faith. The space between your prayer and His response is not a void. It is a vineyard. Something is growing there, patience, character, endurance, trust. And when it blooms, you will understand that divine delay was never divine denial. It was the quiet, masterful rhythm of a God who writes eternity into every second of your story. When God begins to move, it is often not with thunder or spectacle, but with quiet rearrangements that only the attentive heart perceives. We expect the heavens to split, the sea to part, and the miracle to announce itself in glory. Yet, more often, the divine hand moves like wind over tall grass, unseen but unmistakable. God answers many prayers, not the extraordinary, but through the ordinary transformed. You may find that something begins to shift around you without your permission or prediction. A door that once seemed sealed suddenly loosens. A conversation you dreaded turns unexpectedly gentle. A plan that seemed perfect quietly unravels, and another takes its place. One you hadn't considered but somehow feels right. These are not coincidences, they are conversations in disguise. The Creator of the cosmos speaks fluently in the language of subtlety. He writes His answers into the fabric of your days, so that only those who walk by faith can read them. Sometimes the smallest moments carry the weight of heaven. A meeting cancelled, a delay in travel, a chance encounter with a stranger. These may be the very instruments through which God directs your steps. We tend to overlook such moments because they lack the grandeur we associate with miracles. But God is not trying to impress you, He is trying to lead you. He doesn't need to shout when a whisper will do. You prayed for deliverance, and you expected the storm to cease. Instead, you noticed the winds shift slightly, not enough to calm the sea, but enough to steer your boat towards safety. That shift is his answer. You asked for provision, and rather than a flood of abundance, a small opportunity appeared, a single seed of favor that, if planted, could grow into a harvest. That opportunity is his answer. You cried for guidance, and though no voice thundered from the clouds, a new desire began to form in your heart, pointing you toward a different direction. That desire is his answer. The human heart loves the dramatic because it proves what it can see. But the Spirit trains believers to recognize what can only be discerned. Faith is the vision that detects divine fingerprints on the seemingly mundane. When you start to walk closely with God, you realize that He hides in the details, in the timing of a phone call, in the comfort of a word spoken at just the right moment, in the door that didn't open because it wasn't meant to. Each of these quiet events carries the same signature. I have heard you. The enemy of faith often whispers that God's silence means inaction. But silence is not the absence of work, it is the environment of precision. God is never hurried, yet never idle. He weaves answers into the patterns of your life so gently that you rarely recognize them until much later. One day you look back and realize how perfectly things aligned, how one conversation led to another, how one disappointment redirected your steps towards something far better. You will say, I didn't see it then, but He was moving all along. God's methods are subtle because His goal is relationship, not performance. If His answers always arrived with spectacle, we would seek the miracle instead of the miracle worker. By cloaking His work in everyday life, He invites us to stay near, to listen, to notice. He wants you to live not merely as a spectator of wonders, but as a participant in His quiet providence. He teaches you to look for Him not only in answered prayers, but in the slow unfolding of grace that surrounds every day. Sometimes, the subtle shifts He arranges feel like disruption. You might lose something you thought you needed, only to discover later it was protection. A friendship fades, a plan collapses, a door closes, and in the moment you grieve. Yet months later, you see the wisdom of the redirection. What felt like loss was really leadership. God's answers often begin as interruptions because the path to your prayer's fulfillment rarely runs straight. His detours are deliberate. If you pay attention, you will notice that these divine movements always carry a sense of rightness. There's a quiet alignment, a peace beneath the confusion, a whisper that says, this is the way. It doesn't erase uncertainty, but it steadies you enough to take the next step. That is how the shepherd guides his flock, not by giving the full map, but by adjusting their direction moment by moment. So look carefully at your days. Listen for the soft creak of divine hinges opening doors in unexpected places. Pay attention to the coincidences that seem too kind to be random. Notice the interruptions that save you from unseen harm, the new desires that echo God's character, the opportunities that appear at just the right moment. These are not accidents, they are evidence. God has heard your prayer. He is moving not always loudly, but always faithfully, threading His will through every ordinary hour until your life becomes the very answer you once longed for. There comes a point in every believer's journey when prayer stops being a list of requests and becomes an encounter that changes the one who prays. You go before God pleading for Him to alter your circumstances, to bend the world toward your desires. But somewhere in that holy conversation, something unexpected happens. The burden does not lift, yet your will begins to bend instead. What you once asked for starts to matter less than what you are becoming through the asking. This is not defeat. It is transformation. It is one of the clearest signs that God has heard your prayer, because only a heard prayer has the power to reshape the heart of the one who speaks it. Conviction is often the first movement of that transformation. It is not condemnation, not the harsh voice of guilt, but the gentle awakening that comes when divine light exposes hidden corners of the soul. You begin to sense that God is not ignoring you. He is inviting you into alignment. He listens not just to the words of your prayer, but to the posture behind them. And when He finds that posture out of tune with His purpose, He does not answer immediately. He begins to correct the tone. There is mercy in that correction. God could grant your request as it stands, but He loves you too much to let your desires rule you. He knows that a prayer born of fear, pride, or impatience cannot bring lasting peace. So instead of rearranging your circumstances, He rearranges your motives. He uses delay, disappointment, or discomfort as chisels that sculpt your heart into something more reflective of His own. It may feel like silence, but it is sanctification. You can sense this work happening when your prayers begin to change shape. What started as, "Lord, fix this," slowly becomes, "Lord, fix me." You find yourself praying less for escape and more for endurance, less for control and more for surrender. That shift is not weakness. It is divine craftsmanship. It is the potter's hands pressing gently against the clay, shaping it to fit His design. The struggle you feel is not rejection, it is formation. Every moment of conviction is a message from heaven saying, "I am still listening, and I am still working." This redirection of the heart can sometimes feel painful, because it calls you to release what you once clung to. You may feel God pulling you away from certain plans, people, or paths that once seemed essential. It can feel like loss, but it is actually liberation. The shepherd knows when a sheep is headed toward a cliff, and his gentle tug is not punishment but protection. God's redirection is often the clearest evidence of His mercy. He answers not by giving what you ask, but by leading you to what you truly need. When you experience that inner stirring, that sense that something within you must change before anything around you can, that is the Spirit's quiet voice guiding you home. He does not shame, He invites. He does not push, He draws. Conviction is the sound of heaven knocking on the door of your will, asking permission to lead you into truth. Redirection is what happens when you say yes. Over time, you begin to see how every sincere prayer is answered twice, once in heaven's record, and once in the transformation of your heart. Even before the external answer appears, something within you shifts. Your desires align with His, your thoughts soften, your vision clears. What once seemed unbearable now feels purposeful. The very situation that once felt like a prison becomes the classroom where you learn surrender, patience, and faith. It is in those moments of quiet conviction that God often does His deepest work. He uses tension to reveal truth. You ask why your plans are not unfolding as expected, and He whispers, "Because I have a better plan." You wonder why the path you chose feels heavy, and He replies, "Because I am teaching you to walk mine." The detour, the pause, the correction, all are His ways of ensuring your prayer leads you not just to blessing, but to becoming more like Him. If you look closely, you will see that conviction and redirection are not interruptions to prayer but extensions of it. They are the conversation continuing, God responding not only to your words, but to your soul. When your motives change, your focus widens, your heart humbles. That is not your doing alone. It is the invisible echo of divine hearing. It is God saying, "I have heard you, and I am making you ready." And that readiness becomes its own form of peace. You no longer wrestle to get your way, you rest in His way. You no longer fear the unknown, you trust the one who leads through it. And slowly, prayer becomes less about moving God's hand and more about holding it. You discover that the truest answer to prayer is not a changed life, but a changed heart. A heart that has been redirected by the one who listens perfectly, loves completely, and never fails to respond. There comes a time in prayer when you realize the thing you were asking for no longer holds the same weight it once did. What once seemed urgent begins to fade, and something deeper begins to awaken. A longing not just for the answer, but for the answerer. This is one of the holiest transformations that can happen in the life of a believer. It is the moment when your desire shifts from what God can give to who God is. And it is a sure sign that He has heard your prayer, because no human heart drifts toward Him on its own. Only a heart touched by divine response begins to hunger for His presence above all else. When God begins to draw near, everything else starts to lose its glitter. The same prayer that once revolved around personal needs starts to sound different. Quieter, humbler, more intimate. You no longer plead as a beggar at a closed door. You sit as a child in the Father's house. The posture changes from striving to resting. You still ask, but your asking carries peace instead of panic. It is no longer, "Lord, give me," but "Lord, be with me." That change of tone is not self-discipline, it is grace at work. The Spirit within you is teaching your soul to value presence above provision. This desire for God Himself does not erase your earthly needs, but it reorders them. You begin to see that every gift without the giver is hollow. You could have the healing, the success, the breakthrough, and yet still feel empty if His presence were absent. Conversely, when His nearness is real, even unanswered prayers lose their sting. You find joy in communion itself. You start to understand what the psalmist meant when he said, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth I desire besides you." Those are not the words of one who is everything, but of one who has found the only thing worth everything. This renewed desire for God's presence often arrives quietly, like a sunrise over a weary landscape. You may not notice it at first. You simply begin to crave time with Him, moments of stillness, scripture, worship, and reflection. The distractions that once easily satisfied no longer hold you. The noise of the world grows distant. There is a sweetness in silence. Because you have learned that peace does not live in results, it lives in relationship. God's presence becomes the safe place your heart runs to, not just in crisis, but in contentment. Such hunger for His presence is itself an answer to prayer, for only those who have been heard are drawn deeper. God never calls the indifferent into intimacy. If your soul begins to thirst for Him, it means He has already come near. You are not chasing a distant deity, you are responding to a God who has already bent low to meet you. The growing itch to know Him more is His whisper within you saying, "I have heard you, and I want you closer." And yet, this desire can sometimes feel like loss, as though everything else is being stripped away. Things that once brought joy lose their flavor. Relationships change. Ambitions quiet. You may even feel lonely for a time, because the old pleasures no longer fit the new heart God is forming in you. But this is forming loneliness, the kind that leads to intimacy. God is making room within you for Himself. The more space He fills, the less you need from everything else. What once seemed like emptiness is actually expansion. Over time, this hunger matures into peace. You find that even when prayers go unanswered, your faith no longer trembles. You know where your satisfaction lives. You have tasted the difference between temporary comfort and eternal communion. When others chase blessings, you chase the presence that blesses everything it touches. The world cannot understand this kind of contentment. It thinks peace comes from achievement, but you have discovered that peace comes from obedience. There are moments in prayer when you sense that heaven is listening, not because circumstances shift, but because your heart does. The more you desire God, the more you realize that He is already desiring you. The dialogue between your longing and His love becomes the true prayer, one that never ends when you rise from your knees. You carry it through your days like a sacred melody, humming beneath your routines, reminding you that the nearness of God is not just a feeling, it is life itself. To long for His presence is to live awake. It is to see the world not as a field of unmet needs, but as a sanctuary where He walks beside you. The light falls differently on everything when you know that God is with you. The unanswered prayer becomes a classroom for trust. The daily task becomes an altar, and every breath becomes an act of worship. The miracle you once waited for begins to seem small beside the miracle of His companionship. And so, as your heart turns more toward Him, you realize that your greatest prayer has already been answered. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. The gift you sought was never separate from the giver. You prayed for blessing and found the blesser. You asked for a way through and found the way Himself. And in that sacred discovery, that God's presence is the prize, every other longing finds its rest.